Okay, well, today our passage for Sunday is according to the curriculum, 1 Peter chapter 2, 1 through 10. However, you want to make it 1 through 12. Just read the passage. It should be obvious why. Verse 11 and 12 is the application of verses 1 through 10. I'm going to do something I almost never do, perhaps never have done, and that is use the title that the curriculum is using, which is Our Identity. For two reasons. Number one, it actually fits the lesson well. Secondly, it brings up an issue I'm going to spend a lot of time on this morning in this video, and I hope you will take the nuts and bolts, or at least the big idea of this, and use it in your lesson, because it is important, even if you don't think it is important. So everything in this passage certainly applies to us. It's written to New Testament Christians. But the real issue is it written to a congregation that is mostly Gentile? Most all the early churches were mixed on some level of Jews and Gentiles, but most, or at least a lot of commentators and kind of the traditional idea is that this is written to a Gentile, mainly Gentile church, but I definitely do not believe that's true. It's very Jewish in its emphasis on the Old Testament. I'm going to give you several reasons why I believe the original readers of this book, 1 Peter, was a church that was made up of mostly Gentiles, or at least mostly Jews, at least a majority of Jews. And it is important. It's very important. It really is going to influence how you interpret verse 9 and 10, or really verses 5 through 10, but especially the statements of verse 9, you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. So what happens is people that say this is mostly written to Gentile readers will then take this verse and use it as a proof text for the church replacing Israel. The church does not replace Israel. Both are God's people in two different, two different testaments, if you will, two different ages. But let me just run through why I believe very clearly this is a church made up mostly of Jewish people, saved Jews. Number one, Peter's the apostle to the Jews. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. Number two, 1 Peter references lots of Old Testament practices. Just listen to what I just said in verse 9, a chosen race, a royal priesthood, etc., etc. Talks about Christ as being the stone, which I'm going to bring out later in this video about how that's related to Old Testament passages. Thirdly, 1 Peter 1:1 tells us the readers are aliens. An alien is someone living in a land that was originally not where they're from, and that they were scattered abroad. They were scattered to various places. Chapter 1, verse 1, to those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, who are chosen. Gentiles wouldn't have been scattered to those places. They lived in those places. The only scattered people, according to the New Testament, we ever read about are the Jewish believers. For example, Acts chapter 8, verse 1, there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. James, in his epistle, writes to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, again, the dispersing of the Jewish church, which is what the early church was, right? It started at Pentecost with the Jews from all these regions coming into Pentecost and getting saved, many of them staying in Jerusalem and starting the Jerusalem church, but they're scattered abroad. And so now Peter is writing to these believers who certainly would have who helped evangelize Gentiles, would have had Gentiles in their churches, but it was a primarily Jewish audience. Why is this important? I've already mentioned this, because those that take this as a largely Gentile audience will often use this, verses 9 and 10, as a proof text that the church has replaced national Israel as God's chosen people. But that is not what verse 9 and 10 is saying. So let's talk about verse 9 and 10. Verse 9 and 10 actually is referencing, in part, especially verse 10, a statement made in Hosea chapter 1. I'm going to read verses 6 through 11. It says, she conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy, for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. When she had weaned No Mercy, she conceived and bore a son. The Lord said, call his name Not My People, for you are not my people, for I am not your God. Yet, verse 10, the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured by number. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10, for you are once not a people, but now you are the people of God. That's not referring to the Gentiles. That's referring to Israel, who originally were not a people until God called them out and made them a people, made them a nation. But now Hosea is saying your apostasy has put you in a place where God is basically looking at you again as not my people, but I'm going to save you. Now, Israel's never experienced yet that redemption. So as Peter writes to these New Testament believers that were Jewish, largely Jewish, and yet some Gentile, they're all part of the church, right? There's no Jew or Gentile in the church. The church has both. But what he's telling them is you are now experiencing being part of the people of God. And so he uses all these Old Testament references that they would connect with, but it's also giving them assurance that God is going to fulfill his promises to the nation of Israel, that they are still able to be redeemed, and he's going to, because of Christ, we are now even Jews and Gentiles are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Nation can just mean people. It doesn't have to mean an ethnic nation, but God is going to still redeem Israel. So I know that could be a little bit complicated. You're probably thinking I'm making a big deal out of nothing. I'm not. And so in some way, try to at least bring out that the evidence is more that this is a book written to a largely Jewish congregation, not Gentile congregation. Your curriculum doesn't make a big statement about it, but it certainly seems to imply they see it as written to a Gentile congregation as well. But anyways, some other quick observations. Ignore the loud vacuum cleaner in the background. Verse 1, therefore, always points back, and the curriculum says it points back to verse 23 or verse 25. I think it points back to the entire first chapter, because we are obedient children, verse 14, because of all that Christ has done for us. He's inherited us, he's protecting us by the power of God, because he's foreknown us before the foundation of the world, because you've purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, all of those things, then you got to live like it. Chapter 2, verse 1, therefore put aside all malice or wickedness. That's a general term for just wickedness. And then it gets more specific, all deceit and hypocrisy, envy and all slander. By the way, Peter's writing these words. That word for deceit in the Greek is the idea of bait. So he's using a fishing term. Bait is a way to deceive fish, to get them to swallow your hook. And that's something we see a lot of, unfortunately, even within professing Christians, very manipulative people who are somewhat dishonest to try to get something they want. We're not to be that way. So this idea of being holy while we are sanctified, that salvation, as far as being saved, we have a responsibility to develop holiness. And so chapter 2 is emphasizing that, and emphasizing again our relationship to God as living stones, as a people that God has saved to make part of his people. We need to live like it. The term putting aside in the NASV and the King James, I haven't looked it up, but I'm pretty sure it says lay aside. Either way, it is the same Greek word we see in Acts chapter 7, verse 58, when the Jews who were stoning Stephen laid down or laid aside or put aside their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. Same word. It's the idea of taking off our old dirty clothes as the old man and living in the holiness that God expects us as a new person in Christ. It's the same idea that we read about in Colossians chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie one to another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self. I want to talk a little bit about the stone imagery. Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone. He's a living stone in verse 4. This is not a new concept. Again, this is an Old Testament concept that goes all the way back to Genesis 49, verse 24, where it says, "Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob." Parentheses, "From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel." And then Daniel chapter 2, verse 35, and his vision of the different kingdoms talks about Jesus. He doesn't say it by name, but that there would come a stone that would crush all these other kingdoms as God sets up his eternal kingdom. Daniel 2:35, "But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." And then verse 44, as Daniel interprets that vision, says, "God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end." So who's the stone? Who's the King of Kings of this kingdom? It's Jesus Christ. Now there's so much more in this lesson, but I knew I wanted to deal with that first thing, and that was going to take a lot of time. But notice verse 11 and 12. Again, I told you don't skip verse 11 and 12. 11 and 12 is jumping us right back to verse 1. It's a conclusion. Look at verse 11 and 12. "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." Oh, and notice verse 12. I forgot to give this as one of my reasons for this being a Jewish congregation. "Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles." Now, I realize the word Gentile can sometimes be used generically as just a term for unbelievers, but I don't think it's being used that. I think it's being used that way as unbelieving Gentiles. "Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them." Notice what happens to these slandering unbelievers, some of them. As they observe your life, they get saved. Look at the very last phrase of verse 12. "As they observe them, they will glorify God in the day of visitation." They'll actually be children of God by the time Judgment Day comes. Not everybody, but that's the impact your life can have as you live out what you say you believe. If we don't live out what we say we believe, then we'll have the opposite influence. We'll have a very negative influence for the cause of Christ. So anyways, I hope these things will help you in your lesson. Again, please address the issue of the audience. I think it's very important. And I hope you'll be able to put that in a smaller package that can make sense to you and make sense to your class. So have a good lesson, and we'll see you on Sunday.